Top 10 Biggest Secrets and Mysteries of Ancient Egypt. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a world of sand, sun, and stone, to the realm of ancient Egypt. So dim your lights, settle into your blanket, and perhaps sip something warm. We're going to move slowly through history tonight like a river of golden sand slipping between your fingers. And yes, there will be secrets. The kind that feel as if they were whispered through hieroglyphs in darkened temples or hidden behind the faint smell of incense and linen. Ancient Egypt is often imagined as serene and timeless, with pyramids gleaming in the desert sun, pharaohs wearing perfect crowns, and priests conducting elaborate rituals. But, as with all things that seem calm and eternal, there are cracks in the marble, or in this case, the limestone. Behind the iconic images of gods, golden sarcophagi, and elaborate funerary practices, there were petty intrigues, strange obsessions, and mysteries that even today make historians scratch their heads. Some of these we'll never fully solve, and that's okay. Tonight we're not rushing to answers. We're merely letting the enigmas float past, one by one, in a gentle current. So let's drift over to our first secret. The curse that wasn't, or was it? Most of us have heard of the so-called curse of the Pharaohs. The story goes that if you disturb a tomb, death or misfortune will strike. Tutankhamun's tomb is usually the one that comes to mind. Lord Carnarvon, who financed the discovery, died shortly after entering the tomb, which, naturally, made headlines. Newspapers went wild. "Mummy's curse strikes again," they wrote, because, of course, that's exactly what a modern Victorian would believe. But historians are less convinced. A mosquito-borne illness, infections from dusty tombs, and sheer coincidence probably did most of the work. Still, there's something quietly poetic about imagining a small, unseen force, dust, shadows, maybe a very annoyed mummy, sitting in a tomb waiting for intruders to stumble in. And of course, the ancient Egyptians themselves had spells and warnings carved on walls, not to scare tourists, but probably to discourage looters, which makes sense, unless you're Lord Carnarvon. It's fascinating to consider that these elaborate curses weren't always meant as melodrama. They were practical. Don't touch what isn't yours. And yet, centuries later, they've become the backbone of horror stories, documentaries, and late-night fascination. Pharaoh Pepi II, the eternal childhood. Now let's drift over to our next royal oddity, Pepi II, who ruled Egypt for a staggering 94 years. Yes, 94. He became king as a very small child, probably 5 or 6 years old. By the time he died, he had witnessed generations of courtiers come and go, like sand slipping between fingers. And Pepi II's longevity left Egypt with some interesting bureaucratic challenges. He was so young when crowned that his regents had to handle most state affairs, making decisions with the faint hope that the child king would agree once he grew up. But growing up was slow for Pepi II, or at least slow in terms of personal authority. Reports suggest he remained somewhat dependent on advisors throughout his life. He was also noted for extreme indifference in his later years. Letters to him from regional governors pleading for action were ignored. It's almost a perfect portrait of a ruler who had everything, and yet perhaps nothing mattered anymore. The mystery here isn't just in his decisions, or lack thereof, but in how this remarkably long reign shaped Egyptian society. Did the bureaucracy thrive? Did the temples prosper? Or did the kingdom gradually drift into quiet chaos? It's hard to say, because much of the evidence we have is fragmentary, worn smooth by time. The Lost Labyrinth. Egyptians loved their secrets, and sometimes they built them underground. Ancient historians like Herodotus spoke of a labyrinth near Lake Moeris, a structure so vast and complicated that it made the pyramids themselves seem simple. Temples, corridors, hidden chambers, some of it may have survived, much of it likely collapsed or sank beneath the sands. Archaeologists have found traces, but nothing that fully matches the grandeur described in ancient texts. Imagine wandering through a corridor lined with statues, sunlight filtering in from above, only to discover a wall that led nowhere, a hallway of silence where the past waits quietly. The labyrinth is a mystery that lingers like a shadow. Some say it was more symbolic than practical, a representation of the Egyptian idea of the afterlife with its endless twists and turns. Others think it was a genuine architectural feat, deliberately meant to confuse and awe. Either way, it's a mystery that whispers without revealing itself fully. Queen Hatshepsut, the disappearing pharaoh. Hatshepsut was one of Egypt's few female pharaohs. She ruled effectively, traded extensively, and commissioned monumental building projects. Yet after her death, someone, or several someones, decided she should be erased from history. Her statues were defaced, her name chiseled away from inscriptions. Why? Scholars debate. Maybe her successors wanted to reassert male dominance, or perhaps there was jealousy or political necessity. Whatever the reason, Hatshepsut exists in history like a ghost, both celebrated and quietly denied. She represents one of Egypt's enduring secrets. Power and memory are fragile, and even stone can be persuaded to lie. The mysterious disappearance of the Nefertiti bust. The bust of Nefertiti, with her perfectly symmetrical face and enigmatic smile, is one of the most famous artifacts from Egypt. Yet the circumstances of its discovery and why it wasn't fully recorded at the time remain curious. Some speculate the bust was stolen or smuggled. Others suggest it was deliberately hidden. What makes it more intriguing is that Nefertiti herself disappears from the historical record relatively suddenly. Did she die, or was she co-opted into a different role? Scholars can only offer theories. The bust serves as a quiet witness to this mystery, forever staring out with calm, inscrutable eyes, offering no answers, only the gentle suggestion that the past has its own plans. The fragile bloodlines and peculiar lives of ancient royals. As we settle further into the soft hum of history, let's leave the Nile behind for a moment and wander into palaces, courts, and quiet chambers where the sun shines less brightly, but intrigue and eccentricity abound. Tonight, we're moving gently into the lives of rulers, people who inherited enormous power, sometimes before they could tie their own sandals properly. These are the monarchs who achieved greatness mostly by accident, or misfortune, or sheer familial insistence. Let's start with the concept of dynastic inbreeding. The idea was simple enough. Keep the bloodline pure, ideally without introducing too many inconvenient new personalities. Naturally, this led to some rather interesting results. Perhaps one of the most famous examples is Ptolemy XIII of Egypt. A boy king, he inherited the throne while still young enough to nap through the majority of state affairs. To keep things pure, he was married to his sister, Cleopatra VII. A logical plan if you suspend modern notions of romance, biology, and personal preference. Their relationship, predictably, produced both political drama and whispered tales of sibling rivalry. It's the kind of situation that makes you quietly grateful for the mundane complexities of modern marriage counseling. Cleopatra herself is often remembered for her charisma, intelligence, and dramatic alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But let's pause, softly, to appreciate a quieter detail. She was part of a family that treated political power almost like a particularly tedious board game. Brothers and sisters marrying each other, half-siblings competing for the throne, sudden betrayals over the location of a single palace. It's all very civilized, in a tense, portly way, with just enough subtle poisonings and arrests to keep everyone mildly awake at night. Moving northward to Europe, we find similar patterns. The Habsburgs of Spain, for example, perfected the art of carefully planned marriages, producing generations of heirs who were, if nothing else, strikingly consistent in appearance. Charles II of Spain was the unfortunate culmination of this dedication to purity. Nicknamed the Bewitched, he had a jawline so pronouncedly odd that modern dentists and anthropologists have spent hours gently shaking their heads over it. Charles II also suffered numerous health problems, including learning difficulties, which were perhaps unsurprisingly the result of generations of intermarriage. Yet he remained king, largely because in this period nobody thought to suggest that being alive and slightly confused disqualified one from ruling. There's something quietly tragic, almost hypnotically sad, about observing these fragile bloodlines. It's not dramatic in the sense of swords and flames. It's the slow accumulation of small genetic quirks, compounded over decades. A child born with a delicate constitution, a slight deformity, a tendency to fall asleep at inconvenient moments, and the court collectively shrugs and says, "Well, there's still the heir, we'll make it work." The result is an ongoing mixture of mild misfortune and absurdity, like a play performed in slow motion. And while some monarchs struggled silently with physical or mental fragility, others occupied themselves with decidedly odd habits. Consider Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. Naturally, he loved the sun, but also loved the mirror, the stage, and the utterly unnecessary construction of a massive palace at Versailles. Workers toiled endlessly while he perfected the art of ceremonial entryways, extravagant clothing, and elaborate rituals for waking and sleeping. Nothing happened quickly, nothing happened efficiently, but it looked splendid. And it turns out it's soothing to think that even the most powerful people sometimes simply enjoy making an ordinary task as slow and ornate as possible. Then there was Peter the Great of Russia, a man with a particular fondness for shoes, foreign customs, and massive, mildly humiliating reforms. He wanted his nobles to shave their beards and wear Western clothing, which seems minor until you realize he enforced it personally, strolling through St. Petersburg to ensure compliance. One can imagine the gentle terror of a nobleman carefully removing his beard, thinking, "Well, at least I'm not being executed, yet." Peter's fascination with practical skills, shipbuilding, engineering, plumbing, was remarkable, though he sometimes demonstrated them in ways that unsettled visitors. Still, his obsession with progress reminds us that curiosity and eccentricity can exist comfortably side by side. Let's drift, gently, to childhoods in royal households, which were rarely serene. Princes and princesses were often raised in isolation, tutored endlessly, and subjected to strict rules about diet, posture, and the occasional minor ritual sacrifice of their free time. Mary, Queen of Scots, for instance, spent much of her early life under heavy supervision, moved from household to household, and received instruction in politics, languages, and religion while scarcely allowed to play. It's an odd combination, immense privilege paired with almost endless restriction. Perhaps this explains some of the peculiar decisions she made later in life. Or perhaps she simply inherited the family tendency for dramatic flair. Either way, It's comforting, in a sleepy way, to realize that childhood oddities among the elite are nothing new.
The most inbred monarchs in European history. Hello again, and welcome back. Let's keep the lights dim and let your thoughts float slowly. Tonight, we leave the golden sands and pyramids behind and wander into the chilly, opulent halls of European royalty. These were people who inherited crowns, titles, and sometimes, rather unfortunately, each other's genetic mistakes. Inbreeding in royal families wasn't accidental. It was considered prudent, even essential, to preserve bloodlines, maintain alliances, and keep the wealth within a dynasty. In hindsight, of course, it often had less desirable results. But remember, we're not here to judge. We're here to observe, and perhaps sigh quietly at the strange, fragile creatures history placed on thrones. Charles II of Spain, sometimes called El Hechizado, or the Bewitched. And indeed, he was something of a walking cautionary tale. By the time he died in 1700, he had suffered decades of ill health, odd behaviors, and, well, a face that seemed to defy conventional description. He had pronounced jaw malformations, difficulty speaking, and numerous physical ailments, all compounded by generations of intermarriage. His family tree reads like a map of unfortunate marriages. First cousins married first cousins, sometimes repeatedly, as if the royal motto was, "If it's not broken, marry it again." Charles II was the tragic culmination of these genetic experiments. He could not father an heir, and his death ultimately triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, because no one else had the faintest claim that made sense. It's almost comical, if you ignore the immense human suffering and political chaos. A king whose bloodline had been guarded so carefully that it produced a man unable to continue it. And somehow, Europeans continued to insist for decades that careful cousinly marriages were wise. The Habsburg jaw. If you've ever seen a portrait of a Habsburg, you may have noticed the prominent jawline. And yes, it was genetic, thanks to centuries of intermarriage. The Habsburg jaw became a symbol of both prestige and, quietly, fragility. Some Habsburgs could barely chew, speak clearly, or even live long enough to inherit the throne. Yet dynastic pride often overrode common sense. They married cousins, uncles, nieces, anyone with suitable blood. There's something quietly tragic in the juxtaposition, stately, elegant portraits, and, behind the smiles, generations of dental deformities and weak constitutions. It's a reminder that royals were human, often disastrously human, despite all the gold and ceremonial splendor surrounding them. Queen Victoria and the hemophilia epidemic. Moving to the 19th century, Queen Victoria of England was another example of the unintended consequences of royal genetics. Through her children, the gene for hemophilia, a disorder affecting the blood's ability to clot, spread across multiple European royal families, from Germany to Russia. Imagine a network of princes and princesses, each carrying a tiny, invisible ticking time bomb. Some lived full lives, many struggled, and a few tragically died young from minor injuries. Royals arranged marriages to secure alliances, not realizing they were also securing a medical legacy of misery. Queen Victoria herself reportedly referred to it as the family disease, though she could not have known how far it would reach. And so hemophilia became a quietly feared specter, floating invisibly through ballrooms, coronations, and the elaborate tapestries of European history. Charles III of France, the Mad King. Charles VI, King of France in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, was known for his bouts of madness. And by madness, we don't mean a little eccentricity at court. At times, he forgot who he was, attacked his own servants, or wandered the palace corridors in dangerous confusion. Some historians link his condition to the genetic consequences of repeated intermarriage among French and Burgundian royalty. Others suggest it was simply the stress of ruling a fractured kingdom, plagued by war and political intrigue. Either way, Charles VI's reign was a slow-motion tragedy, marked by fear, instability, and, occasionally, a touch of dark absurdity. You can imagine the courtiers, walking on eggshells, trying not to irritate a king who might suddenly believe he was made of glass, or that he had become a wild animal. And yet, history preserves him in a dry, almost clinical way, a reminder that heredity and power can collide in unsettling ways. The Spanish Habsburgs' decline. Returning briefly to Spain, the Spanish Habsburgs continued to illustrate the perils of inbreeding. Successive generations produced kings and queens with physical deformities, weak constitutions, and short lifespans. Political influence dwindled as the body failed to match the crown. By the time the last Habsburg king, Charles II, came to power, Spain's empire was already strained, overextended, and politically precarious. The combination of external pressures and internal fragility is a reminder that dynasties are not immortal, no matter how impressive their architecture, titles, or ceremonial splendor. History, in a way, quietly chuckles at these attempts to preserve pure bloodlines, showing that nature has its own, often inconvenient, sense of humor. We've now covered several of Europe's most inbred monarchs and the strange, fragile legacies they left behind. The pattern is clear. Dynastic pride often trumped reason, producing rulers who could barely hold a court, speak clearly, or survive childhood. Yet these same figures shaped history for better or worse, leaving behind castles, treaties, wars, and an indelible sense of tragic absurdity. Tonight, as you drift, imagine these ornate halls heavy with tapestries and candlelight, echoing faintly with the whispers of kings who were, in many ways, far less than they appeared.
Egyptians had a cat obsession that went way beyond cute. Today, people love cats. Ancient Egyptians, however, worshipped them, not symbolically, literally. Bastet, the goddess of home and protection, was often depicted as a cat or lioness, and that seemed to give Egyptians full permission to let their love go a bit too far. Killing a cat, even accidentally, was punishable by death. Households mourned their cats by shaving their eyebrows, a very bold fashion statement that would have been hard to explain to your neighbors. And archaeologists have found entire cat cemeteries, rows upon rows of mummified cats, wrapped neatly and sent to the afterlife with more care than some actual humans received. It's charming in a way, slightly unsettling, but charming. You can almost picture an Egyptian priest trying to conduct the ceremony while 30 sacred cats wander through the temple, knocking over incense burners with divine disregard. We drift onward. Their afterlife beliefs were complicated and slightly bureaucratic. If you think modern paperwork is exhausting, ancient Egyptian afterlife requirements would make you long for the gentle simplicity of tax forms. To reach paradise, you needed spells, protective amulets, passwords, rituals, a heart light enough to pass a divine weight test, and, of course, a body preserved well enough to be recognized by your spirit. Mummification wasn't just preservation, it was preparation for a cosmic exam. You needed your organs stored carefully, your body dried thoroughly, and your tomb filled with food, clothes, furniture, makeup, and, in some cases, you guessed it, cats. The heart was left inside the body because it was believed to contain your mind and soul. The brain, meanwhile, was scooped out and discarded like unused packaging, which feels like a metaphor for something, though we don't have to decide what. Let's drift gently to the next one.
Royal marriages that went horribly, genetically, wrong.
Welcome back. If you've been following along, your mind is likely drifting gently among corridors of palaces, dusty tombs, and elaborate gowns. Let's stay in that soft haze as we explore the peculiar, sometimes tragic, consequences of royal marriages, arranged with great care, often for political advantage, and frequently disastrous for biology. Royal marriages were never about love, not really. They were about alliances, property, and bloodlines. Yet, in the attempt to preserve pure dynasties, European royals repeatedly overlooked a quiet truth. Marrying cousins over generations tends to produce, well, peculiar results. The Habsburgs, again, marital madness. We've mentioned the Habsburg jaw before, but the consequences go far beyond a prominent chin. The Habsburgs frequently married within their own extended family to maintain political power, producing a cascade of genetic complications. Charles II of Spain was not only the culmination of centuries of inbreeding, but also a direct result of carefully orchestrated Habsburg marriages. He inherited fragile health, a distorted jaw, and difficulty walking. These unions were meant to consolidate power, but instead they left behind kings who could barely rule and queens with limited fertility. Imagine the marriage negotiations, diplomats sitting across oak tables, meticulously tracing family trees, muttering, "First cousins, yes, twice removed, also acceptable." And yet the results were far less impressive than the paperwork suggested. It's a quiet lesson in hubris. Bloodlines matter, but nature has its own plans. Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, youthful optimism meets royal obligation. Moving to France, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI's marriage is often romanticized in portraits and films. In reality, it was an awkward, politically motivated union. Both were young, Marie barely 14, Louis 15, thrust into the weighty expectations of the French crown. Louis had difficulty consummating the marriage initially, a problem often attributed to both age and the pressure of expectation. Over time, they produced children, yet the marriage remained more a matter of duty than affection. There's something quietly tragic here. Two teenagers wrapped in silk, jewels, and centuries of tradition trying to navigate intimacy and alliance simultaneously. History, as ever, enjoys pointing out the irony. The young queen later vilified in pamphlets, the king indecisive, the revolution inevitable. But for now, picture the two of them in a dimly lit chamber, awkward and hopeful, unaware of the chaos to come. Tsar Nicholas II and Alexandra of Russia represent a quiet genetic tragedy. Alexandra was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, carrying the hemophilia gene that would afflict her son Alexei. Nicholas, devoted but politically naive, married into a family whose bloodline had unintended consequences. The result was personal suffering and arguably political instability. Alexei's hemophilia required constant attention, while the royal couple's reliance on the mystic Rasputin further undermined public confidence. Here we see genetics, superstition, and governance colliding with unfortunate elegance. It's almost cinematic in its quiet despair. A small boy suffering from a disease nobody could cure, a devoted mother clinging to mystics, a father trying desperately to maintain the dignity of the crown, all under the heavy gilded ceilings of the Winter Palace. The Spanish Bourbons, cousins to many European dynasties, repeatedly married within their extended family. Their unions produced children who often struggled with fertility, illness, and physical fragility. These marriages were intended to consolidate alliances, yet the results were underwhelming. Several generations of kings and queens struggled to maintain heirs, leaving political continuity precarious. It's almost amusing if you ignore the human suffering, a meticulous plan executed flawlessly on paper, yet faltering spectacularly in reality. The Medici, wealth over wisdom. In Italy, the Medici family exemplified the quiet hazards of dynastic marriages, though in a slightly different way. Wealth, influence, and titles mattered more than genetic prudence. Members of the family frequently married first cousins to consolidate banking power. Over generations, this produced rulers and heirs with varying health issues, intellectual gifts sometimes compromised by fragile constitutions and occasional political misjudgments. And yet, the Medici survived and even flourished. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes money can outweigh the subtle tyranny of heredity, but not without cost.
Leopold I of Belgium. Fragile heirs. Leopold I, a German prince turned Belgian king, married his nieces and cousins to maintain political alliances. The results were mixed. Some children thrived, others were frail or died young. Once again, duty and strategy eclipsed biology. And once again, the human consequences were quietly tragic. Consider the quiet chambers of royal palaces, children sickly, parents devoted yet powerless, doctors perplexed, all under the shadow of dynastic ambition. It's a gentle, unsettling reminder that monarchy is often a performance imposed upon very fragile humans. The Danish kings, inbreeding in Scandinavia. Scandinavian royalty also fell prey to these patterns. Danish kings frequently married cousins or members of other royal houses, resulting in heirs who were physically and mentally compromised. These unions were strategic, meant to preserve influence across Europe, but they illustrate the same quiet, tragic lesson that genetics has little regard for politics. One can almost hear the faint sighs in the palace corridors as advisors arranged another union, tracing family trees with careful precision, oblivious to the subtle tragedies they were setting in motion. The Portuguese royals. Repetition and fragility. In Portugal, similar patterns emerged. Repeated cousin marriages over centuries produced monarchs with health challenges, sometimes leaving the line of succession uncertain. Political strategy again outweighed human concerns, and the consequences quietly were visible in fragile bodies and short lives. Imagine the endless ceremonies, the grand portraits, the lineage charts drawn with precision. Behind all of it, human frailty persisted, an uninvited guest at every royal gathering. Maximilian I of Mexico. Imported fragility. Even beyond Europe, the practice of dynastic marriages had consequences. Maximilian I, Emperor of Mexico, a Habsburg by birth, carried the fragile genes of his lineage into the New World. His reign was short, fraught with political difficulties, and ultimately fatal. Here we see an interesting convergence. European dynastic habits exported abroad, colliding with unfamiliar politics and environments. Genetics, ambition, and circumstance combined to quietly shape history in ways that were less spectacular than battles or revolutions, but just as inexorable. A gentle reminder: marriage, duty, and biology. As we drift through these stories, it's worth pausing to consider the larger lesson. Royal marriages were meticulously planned, celebrated, and chronicled. Yet behind the gilded veneer, fragile human lives endured the quiet consequences of ambition, politics, and heredity. Some marriages produced brilliance, others disaster, most somewhere in between. And for us, lying quietly in dim light, these stories offer both melancholy and gentle humor. There is a quiet absurdity in imagining meticulously arranged unions creating frail heirs, hemophilic princes, and kings who couldn't walk or speak clearly. History, in its slow, deliberate way, offers us the satisfaction of understanding, without ever quite resolving, the quirks of human nature.
The pettiest and most dysfunctional kings and queens. Welcome back. If you've been following, your mind has likely wandered through tombs, palaces, and elaborate European courts. Now, let's linger among monarchs whose flaws were less about genetics or politics and more about personality. Those rulers who were, in a word, extraordinarily petty and sometimes quietly disastrous in their personal behavior. Royalty, for all its ceremony and grandeur, is not immune to human foibles. In fact, the combination of inherited privilege, absolute authority, and isolation often amplifies quirks, insecurities, and obsessions. Some monarchs were simply inefficient. Others could be spiteful, vain, or oddly fixated on trivial matters. Tonight, we observe them with gentle amusement and soft curiosity. Henry VIII of England, the obsessive collector. Henry VIII is famous for many things: his 6 marriages, his split from the Catholic Church, and his imposing physique. But beneath all that pomp, he had a streak of almost childlike pettiness. He enjoyed flaunting his power in surprisingly trivial ways, such as orchestrating elaborate punishments for courtiers who displeased him, or obsessively collecting art, books, and even musical instruments. His whims could change daily, and the consequences were often fatal for anyone unfortunate enough to be in the wrong mood on the wrong day. History remembers him as larger than life, but in many ways, he was simply a man ruled by obsession and temper. Marie de Medici, the Queen of France and mother to Louis XIII, had a reputation for intrigue. She could turn the smallest slight into a political conspiracy and spent decades navigating a court full of rivals she often exaggerated in her mind. Her personality has been described as imperious, petty, and sometimes downright vindictive. She fostered factions, manipulated alliances, and occasionally turned against her own children, all while maintaining a composed exterior. It's almost charming, in a melancholy way, to picture her quietly plotting over tea or letters, surrounded by courtiers who never quite knew when they might fall into disfavor. Ivan the Terrible, petty in the extreme. Ivan IV of Russia appears again, but from a different perspective. Beyond his well-known bouts of violence, he could be extraordinarily petty in daily matters. Small disagreements often escalated into severe punishment, including the execution of entire households for minor perceived slights. He maintained a court of terror, where even minor affronts could have devastating consequences. And yet, he could also retreat into moments of private melancholy, a complex mix of cruelty, paranoia, and occasional introspection. There's a quiet fascination in imagining the vast Kremlin corridors echoing with whispers and tension as courtiers tiptoed around a man capable of extreme pettiness. Louis XIV, the Sun King, and his little furies. Louis XIV, the Sun King, ruled France with immense authority and a carefully crafted image of absolute power. Yet even this grand monarch was occasionally consumed by trivial indignities. He would fixate on the precise placement of furniture, the etiquette of his courtiers, or the tone of a remark made in passing. Small errors in protocol could provoke long, quiet rages that lasted for days. And yet, the monarchy continued. Palace life, for all its rituals, absorbed the eccentricities of kings like Louis. For the modern observer, it's almost comforting. Even the most powerful monarchs could be distracted by minutiae, their grand ambitions occasionally tripped up by the smallest irritations. Catherine the Great. Ambition and personal quirks. Catherine II of Russia, known as Catherine the Great, was an enlightened despot in many ways, but she had her own streaks of pettiness. She could hold grudges for years, maneuver politically to isolate rivals, and was occasionally impulsive in personal matters. Her personal life was notoriously complicated, with lovers and court intrigues shaping much of her daily existence. Yet she maintained the appearance of calm, intellect, and authority. quietly manipulating both family and state alike. It's soothing, in a way, to think of her calmly reading in the Winter Palace while plotting the fates of her courtiers with quiet precision, a ruler entirely in control of her image, but never free from human quirks.
Queen Christina of Sweden, eccentric and detached. Queen Christina of Sweden is remembered for her unconventional behavior. She abdicated her throne voluntarily, converted religions unexpectedly, and surrounded herself with philosophers and artists rather than traditional courtiers. Her eccentricity extended to her personal habits. She dressed in male clothing, engaged in intellectual debates, and lived in ways that bewildered her contemporaries. Christina's life illustrates how royal authority could be both liberating and isolating, allowing personal quirks to flourish, but often leaving her at odds with the expectations of those around her. Frederick the Great, music, minor grievances, and tyranny. Frederick II of Prussia, known as Frederick the Great, is often celebrated for military skill and philosophical interests. Yet he was also a man of peculiar habits. He obsessed over music, cultivated intimate friendships with a select few, and could harbor minor grievances that lasted decades. His courtiers learned to navigate the labyrinth of his moods, balancing admiration with caution. History remembers Frederick for grand achievements, but the quieter, everyday eccentricities, the personal pettiness, the exacting standards, the intense musical preferences offer a more human portrait. George IV of the United Kingdom, vanity and fragility. George IV, Prince Regent and later King, was famous for vanity, indulgence, and personal fragility. He obsessed over fashion, appearance, and social standing, often neglecting political responsibilities. His relationships were troubled, from estranged wives to alienated family members. Yet he maintained the trappings of royalty with remarkable flair, proving that personal eccentricities need not prevent grandeur, just moral clarity, or perhaps stability. Charles VI of France revisited, mad or miserable. Returning briefly to Charles VI, the so-called Mad King, we see a man whose pettiness and paranoia could manifest in extreme ways. Courtiers walked on eggshells, unsure whether a casual comment might provoke a dangerous reaction. His episodes, believing he was made of glass, attacking servants, wandering corridors in confusion, are both tragic and quietly surreal. They remind us that dysfunction is not always dramatic in the cinematic sense. Sometimes it is slow, creeping, and oddly mesmerizing. A gentle reflection on dysfunction. As we drift past these monarchs, it's striking how often power and personality collide. Petty obsessions, fragile tempers, and unusual habits coexist with immense authority, shaping history quietly as much as dramatically. There's a calm fascination in imagining the small irritations of kings and queens, the misplaced chair, the forgotten greeting, the minor insult that becomes a political maneuver. History preserves the grand events, wars and treaties, but it also preserves these tiny human foibles that ripple through time. For us, lying quietly in dim light, these stories are both soothing and slightly humorous. We see the humanity behind the crowns, the quirks behind the robes, and the gentle absurdity of expecting perfection from the deeply imperfect.
Sickly, spoiled, and sad. Medieval royal childhoods. Welcome back. By now, you may be feeling the quiet pull of history settling around you, like a heavy velvet curtain drawn slowly across a palace window. Let's linger in the softer, quieter corners of history tonight. The nursery, the playroom, the childhood chambers of medieval royalty. Royal children were meant to be heirs, future rulers, symbols of dynastic strength. Yet many were fragile, sickly, or simply overwhelmed by the weight of expectation. Their lives, luxurious as they may have been, were often governed by rules, rituals, and pressures that few adults could endure. For us, there is both tragedy and gentle fascination in imagining these young lives, confined by bloodlines and ambition. Edward V of England, the boy king. Edward V became King of England at the tender age of 12, following the death of his father, Edward IV. His reign was short and in many ways tragic. He never ruled independently. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed as his protector. Edward's life was filled with ritual, education, and expectation. Every action, every word was scrutinized. Yet he was also vulnerable, a child thrust into the dangerous currents of politics. Within months, he and his brother disappeared from the Tower of London, presumed murdered, a grim reminder that royal childhood could be perilously brief. It's quietly harrowing to imagine a boy, barely old enough to understand power, standing in shadowed towers, learning to navigate a world filled with danger, intrigue, and ambition far beyond his years. Henry VI of England, fragile and overwhelmed. Henry VI became king as an infant, inheriting the English throne during a period of war and instability. His life was dominated by regents, advisors, and tutors who attempted to steer the kingdom while the child slept, cried, and grew. Henry was physically and mentally fragile, often withdrawn and plagued by episodes of melancholy. He struggled to assert himself even as an adult, and the country suffered from his incapacity. Yet in his early years, he was simply a child, subjected to a world that demanded competence far beyond his capacity. There's a gentle sadness here. The noblest of intentions, preparing a child to rule, colliding with human frailty and the unpredictability of youth. Mary, Queen of Scots, Education and Isolation. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, inherited a crown as an infant, and her childhood was a careful mixture of education, etiquette, and exile. Sent to France for her upbringing, she was educated in multiple languages, arts, and the subtle arts of diplomacy. Yet, despite this careful cultivation, her youth was isolated. She had tutors, companions, and attendants, but few genuine peers. The loneliness, combined with political intrigue, shaped a childhood that was both privileged and strangely lonely. Mary's life reminds us that royal childhood often came at the cost of ordinary joy. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King's early trials. Even Louis XIV, later the Grand Sun King, endured a complicated childhood. Though born into wealth and power, he was initially overshadowed by his mother, Anne of Austria, and the powerful minister, Cardinal Mazarin. His early years were a mixture of strict supervision, careful ritual, and an awareness of his own importance. Louis would later wield absolute power with confidence, but as a child, he navigated a complex hierarchy of adults, courtiers, and tutors, learning that authority came with both privilege and profound isolation. Charles I of England, groomed for a crown. Charles I grew up with every advantage imaginable, yet childhood was no guarantee of ease. He was carefully educated in history, languages, and the arts of diplomacy, but personal freedom was limited. The pressure to conform, to embody the future of the monarchy, left little space for ordinary play or mischief.
It's quietly remarkable the extent to which royal children were molded from the earliest age, almost like living clay, shaped by tutors, advisors, and the invisible hand of dynastic expectation. And while some flourished, others, like Charles, carried the burden of their upbringing into adulthood, often with tragic consequences. The Spanish infantes, privilege and fragility.
In Spain, royal children, or infantes, were pampered, protected, and educated with meticulous care. Yet many were plagued by illness, malnutrition despite wealth, and the ever-present specter of dynastic responsibility. Some died young, victims of infectious disease or the genetic consequences of intermarriage. Others survived, but were fragile, sickly, or temperamentally ill-suited to the throne. Their childhoods, while gilded, were never simple or carefree. They were rehearsals for duties that would arrive far too early. Richard III, early loss and responsibility. Even Richard III, later King of England, endured a childhood shaped by political upheaval. Born into a family embroiled in the Wars of the Roses, he lost relatives, saw treachery, and navigated early responsibilities that would test any adult. Imagine the young Richard walking through shadowed corridors of noble estates, observing alliances, betrayals, and the weight of family expectation. Childhood, in his world, was a careful balance between learning, survival, and early political education. Edward III of England, groomed for war. Edward III was another example of a royal child trained for responsibility from an early age. Education, martial training, and the cultivation of dignity occupied most of his early years. Games were often exercises in strategy or discipline, preparing him for the political and military burdens ahead. It's worth noting how structured, sometimes rigid, these childhoods were. They were not free to wander, play, or experiment. Every action was measured, every lesson designed to mold the future monarch. The fragile heirs of Burgundy. The Dukes of Burgundy, like many dynasties, carefully groomed their children for rule. Many heirs were sickly, short-lived, or temperamentally unsuited to leadership. The combination of overprotection, rigid upbringing, and inherited frailty often produced rulers who were ill-prepared for the harsh realities of politics. Yet in their youth, they were children first, playing with miniature versions of swords and thrones, blissfully unaware of the world's expectations. There's a quiet poignancy in imagining these moments before duty overwhelmed them. A gentle reflection on royal childhoods. As we drift past these chambers, nurseries, and corridors, we notice a common theme. Royal childhoods were a mixture of privilege, expectation, and quiet fragility. Illness, isolation, and early responsibility shaped young rulers in profound ways. For us, lying quietly in dim light, these stories are both melancholic and soothing. We can imagine the soft laughter of a child in a distant tower, the faint echo of a tutor's voice, and the quiet weight of destiny pressing on small shoulders. Royal children were human in the end, fragile, curious, and inevitably caught between privilege and obligation. Royal decisions that went hilariously or tragically wrong. Welcome back. By now you may be feeling fully immersed in the quiet oddities of history, as if wandering through long shadowed corridors of palaces and halls where time moves more slowly. Let's linger over the peculiar choices made by monarchs, decisions that seemed wise at the time, but in hindsight range from amusingly absurd to quietly disastrous. Even absolute power doesn't guarantee wisdom. Sometimes it amplifies poor judgment, small obsessions, or miscalculations. And while history often emphasizes wars or treaties, it's these subtle human errors that reveal the private, sometimes comedic lives of those crowned.
Louis XVI and the flight to Varennes. Louis XVI of France, already nervous and indecisive, made the fateful choice to attempt escape during the French Revolution in 1791. The plan was meticulously orchestrated, or so he hoped, but went spectacularly wrong. Dressed inconspicuously, in theory, the royal family was recognized, captured, and returned to Paris. The attempt undermined any remaining public support, ultimately sealing Louis's fate. It's almost charming, in a melancholy way, to imagine the king's nervous hope, the carriage journey, and the quiet unraveling of a plan intended to preserve both dignity and life. Napoleon's invasion of Russia. Napoleon Bonaparte, brilliant as he was, misjudged the Russian winter in 1812. His decision to advance deep into Russian territory, ignoring the vast distances and the logistical nightmare of supply lines, resulted in catastrophe. Troops starved, froze, and succumbed to disease. The grand plan of conquest collapsed quietly, brutally, and inexorably. For us observing history softly, it's a reminder that even the most brilliant minds can overlook practical realities, and that hubris combined with nature can quietly undo empires. Henry VIII's religious experimentation. Henry VIII, beyond his matrimonial adventures, made a series of religious decisions that destabilized England. By breaking from the Catholic Church, he created the Church of England, dissolved monasteries, and redistributed wealth and land. Some moves were politically shrewd, others were impulsive, motivated by personal desire rather than governance. His successors inherited a kingdom both enriched and divided, burdened by consequences far beyond Henry's immediate interests. It's a slow, almost ironic lesson in how private whims can reverberate across centuries. Charles I and the personal rule. Charles I of England decided in 1629 to rule without Parliament for 11 years. This personal rule might have seemed elegant on paper: absolute authority, no interference, a monarch unrestrained. In practice, it was disastrous. Political tensions escalated, finances faltered, and public discontent simmered. Eventually, the result was civil war, regicide, and decades of instability. The quiet irony is palpable. A decision intended to secure authority instead undermined it completely. Marie Antoinette's public image. Marie Antoinette, in the decades before the French Revolution, made numerous small decisions that compounded her public unpopularity. Extravagant spending, perceived indifference, and a series of ill-advised statements gave pamphleteers plenty of material. Her famous, though likely misattributed remark, "Let them eat cake," epitomizes how perception can outweigh reality. Small errors, repeated and magnified, quietly built a case against her, illustrating how even minor personal decisions can have monumental consequences when combined with the glare of history.
The Russian Tsars and military miscalculations. Several Russian Tsars made strategic decisions that backfired. Alexander I initially underestimated Napoleon, Nicholas I mismanaged the Crimean War, and Alexander III's rigid policies often provoked unrest. Each decision might have seemed reasonable in context, maintaining prestige, defending borders, asserting authority. Yet the cumulative effect of misjudgment, overconfidence, or simply bad timing led to political and military disasters. History, in these cases, moves slowly, quietly punishing minor errors with disproportionately large consequences. Frederick II of Prussia. Obsessive planning. Frederick the Great, meticulous in many ways, sometimes allowed obsession with detail to cloud judgment. Minor miscalculations in diplomacy,
planning, or logistics occasionally led to unnecessary strain on his army or treasury. Even the greatest generals, it seems, are not immune to human foibles. The quiet lesson here is that control can be seductive, and that overthinking, while seeming prudent, sometimes quietly undermines outcomes. George IV of the United Kingdom. Personal excess. George IV, with his obsession with fashion, appearance, and indulgence, made decisions that strained the treasury and irritated his ministers. Palaces were expanded, debts accumulated, and public opinion turned sharply against him. His decisions were less about national policy and more about personal preference, but history notes them anyway. And for us, lying in dim light, it's oddly comforting. Even kings can be preoccupied with trivialities, and yet still leave a mark on history. The mistakes of Louis XV. Louis XV of France, a king often criticized for frivolity, oversaw decisions that weakened the monarchy subtly over decades. Military campaigns, court favoritism, and indulgent policies all accumulated quietly, eroding both finances and public trust. His reign is a study in how slow, seemingly minor decisions can produce major consequences over time. There's no dramatic flash here, just the gentle accumulation of misjudgment and indulgence, like dust collecting on a palace mantelpiece. Reflection on royal decisions. As we drift past these examples, it's striking how often history hinges not on brilliance, but on small errors magnified by power. Kings and queens, operating under immense pressure, make choices that seem reasonable, urgent, or necessary, only to discover the quiet irony of unintended consequences. There's a gentle lesson here, and perhaps a soothing one. Power, no matter how absolute, cannot entirely overcome human fallibility. And sometimes the most memorable moments of history are quiet, subtle, and quietly absurd. Decisions made in chambers, corridors, and private studies, echoing through time long after the monarchs themselves have faded. The strange habits and personal oddities of monarchs. Welcome back. By now, you may feel as though you are wandering through dimly lit corridors, hearing the faint echoes of footsteps on marble floors, glimpsing gilded chambers where the quirks of kings and queens played out in soft shadows. Tonight, we linger on the oddities, the personal habits, little obsessions, and eccentricities that made monarchs human in the most peculiar ways. Power and privilege sometimes amplify peculiar behaviors. When one is surrounded by luxury, unchallenged authority, and a court eager to please, even the smallest quirks can flourish unchecked. And history, quietly, preserves them for us to observe with gentle curiosity. Charles VI of France, the Glass King. Charles VI deserves another quiet mention, this time for one of his more famous oddities. He believed, at times, that he was made of glass, a fragile, breakable object that could shatter if touched. His courtiers, understandably anxious, padded hallways and guided him with utmost care. It is a haunting image, a king, a symbol of absolute authority, convinced of his own fragility, navigating marble corridors as though one misstep could end the dynasty. There's a tragic humor here, soft and subdued. Power and paranoia intertwining in a single mind, producing a delicate spectacle that history records with both fascination and sorrow. Peter the Great, tall, energetic, and unusually hands-on. Peter I of Russia, or Peter the Great, was known for his extraordinary energy and unusual habits.
He preferred working alongside carpenters, shipbuilders, and blacksmiths, often engaging in tasks far beneath what most monarchs would attempt. He measured rooms obsessively, conducted inspections at odd hours, and insisted on being directly involved in military and naval planning. His quirks were less dangerous than some, but they set him apart, a king who walked among commoners, yet demanded perfection in everything he touched. There's a gentle fascination in imagining Peter, sleeves rolled up, hammer in hand, insisting that even the smallest detail of a ship be flawless. It's a reminder that eccentricity does not always diminish authority. It sometimes reinforces it, quietly and inexorably. Ludwig II of Bavaria, Castles and Dreams. Ludwig returns, this time focusing on his extraordinary obsession with architecture. His castles were vast, elaborate, and almost dreamlike. Neuschwanstein, in particular, embodies a fantasy world that dwarfed both reality and the kingdom's finances. He walked the halls, inspecting every detail, imagining himself within a medieval romance. For Ludwig, reality was secondary to imagination, and personal fascination became a lifelong pursuit. His eccentricity was quiet, melancholy, and utterly absorbing. Imagine him, wandering empty corridors lit by candlelight, lost in his visions, oblivious to the mundane concerns of governance or finance. There is something deeply soothing in observing such devotion to personal whim, even as it isolates him from the world. Charles II of Spain, fragile and odd. Charles II of Spain, already familiar to us, had personal habits that reflected his fragile health and isolation. He had difficulty eating, walking, and sometimes speaking clearly. His daily routines were often dictated by the limitations of his body rather than preference. Yet in these limitations there is a peculiar humanity. A king, weighed down by expectation, finds his own rhythm, his own quiet patterns, navigating the pressures of rule in a manner uniquely his own. It's almost meditative to consider how his small routines intersected with the grand sweep of history. George III of England, obsessed and methodical. George III, remembered for bouts of mental illness, also had unusual habits in daily life. He meticulously supervised his household, his garden, and even his clothing. Ritual and routine provided comfort and control, a personal order against a world of complexity. His eccentricities were not loud or violent. They were quiet, methodical, and enduring. Observing them is almost soothing, a king arranging his life with care, finding stability in repetition, a gentle counterpoint to the turbulent events of his reign.
Catherine the Great, Letters and Secret Passions. Catherine II of Russia had her own array of private habits. She wrote letters obsessively, managed correspondence with precision, and maintained personal routines that balanced intellect, pleasure, and duty. Her private life was punctuated by intimate relationships, which she navigated with discretion and strategic consideration. These personal oddities, the letters, the routines, the quiet manipulations, reveal a monarch whose personal life was as structured and deliberate as her governance. Elizabeth I of England, Rituals of Power. Elizabeth I cultivated a series of habits and routines designed to maintain control, display authority, and reinforce her image. Daily audiences, elaborate ceremonies, and careful management of court appearances were part of a rhythm that shaped perception. Behind these rituals, Elizabeth was also human, curious, playful, and occasionally indulgent. Her personal habits, quiet as they may have been, were an essential part of her survival and the projection of power. They reveal that even the most disciplined monarchs require personal anchors, small habits to structure an unpredictable world. Philip II of Spain, obsessive order. Philip II's eccentricities often manifested in obsession with order, from meticulous record-keeping to exacting standards for court life. He imposed a structure that could be both stabilizing and suffocating. His personal habits extended into governance, blending private obsession with public administration. The result was a kingdom that functioned with precision, yet often at the cost of flexibility and spontaneity. For us, observing these habits is quietly fascinating. A monarch whose personal quirks shaped an empire in subtle, enduring ways. The Habsburgs again, rituals and isolation. Many Habsburg monarchs cultivated eccentric routines and rituals that reinforced isolation. Meals, sleep, and public appearances were often governed by strict habit. Small eccentricities, obsessive diet choices, peculiar dress, or unusual postures became markers of identity and status. The gentle irony is that these habits, seemingly trivial, often defined court life, influencing courtiers, diplomats, and the perception of power. Even small personal choices rippled quietly through history. Reflection on personal oddities. As we drift past these monarchs, we notice a recurring theme. Absolute power often allows idiosyncrasy to flourish. Obsessions, rituals, and personal quirks, whether quiet or elaborate, define not just private life, but the texture of history itself. There's a calm fascination in observing these behaviors. Kings walking carefully through marble halls, queens writing letters by candlelight, monarchs lost in dreams of castles, music, or gardens. These habits, sometimes odd, sometimes trivial, remind us that human nature persists even under crowns of gold and thrones of power.
Royal misadventures, scandals, and private follies. Welcome back. By now, you may feel as though you are wandering silently through palace corridors, where the echoes of history blend with the soft rustle of gowns, the faint murmur of servants, and the whispered intrigues of kings and queens. Tonight, we linger on misadventures, scandals, and the private follies of monarchs. Those moments where privilege met impulsivity and human nature quietly trumped decorum. These stories are often remembered with judgment or drama, but there is a gentle fascination in imagining the personalities behind the crowns, the private errors that quietly rippled through dynasties. Louis XV of France, lovers and court intrigue. Louis XV of France was famously indulgent in matters of love. His personal life produced a succession of mistresses, some politically influential, others quietly scandalous. The court, predictably, buzzed with rumors, alliances shifted, and political decisions were occasionally guided by desire rather than wisdom. The king's misadventures were less about violence and more about indulgence and whimsy. There is a faintly humorous image of courtiers tiptoeing around, aware that influence could hinge on proximity to a mistress rather than competence. History, in its quiet way, preserves these private follies as both humanizing and slightly absurd. George IV and the Brighton Pavilion. George IV, obsessed with pleasure, extravagance, and personal comfort, built the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, a palace so ornate, so whimsical, that it seems almost fantastical. The building was a personal indulgence, a private folly of immense cost and questionable taste. For historians, it illustrates the subtle interplay between personality and authority. A king's private pleasures could shape architecture, social life, and even national finances. For us,
It is quietly entertaining to picture George strolling through halls of exotic tiles, imagining himself in faraway fantasies while the world waited. Charles II of England, the Merry Monarch. Charles II, sometimes called the Merry Monarch, indulged in pleasures, entertainment, and courtly excess. While his reign restored stability after the Commonwealth, his private life was filled with affairs, mistresses, and casual disregard for conventional morality. His misadventures were personal, occasionally political, and always quietly entertaining. The contrast between public duty and private indulgence creates a soft, ironic distance that is strangely soothing for us to observe from afar. The affair of the diamond necklace. One of the most infamous scandals of the 18th century involved Marie Antoinette and the so-called diamond necklace affair. Though she was innocent, rumors and manipulation created a public scandal that undermined her reputation. The incident illustrates how even a queen, surrounded by luxury and ceremony, could be swept into misadventure through deception and rumor. There is a gentle irony here. A small misunderstanding spirals into historical consequence, reminding us that perception often outweighs reality. The English stewards, private follies and political consequences. The Stuart kings of England, from James I to Charles I, often combined personal quirks with political misjudgments. James I's obsession with astrology and courtly rituals, Charles I's rigid devotion to absolutism, and their shared tendency toward indulgence created tension and instability. These private follies, while subtle, rippled outward, shaping public opinion, political alliances, and eventually the course of revolutions. For us, the fascination lies in the quiet way human nature persists, even when draped in crowns and robes of state.
Peter the Great's Western experiments. Peter I, obsessed with modernizing Russia along Western lines, imposed personal and social experiments that were sometimes absurd. Beards were taxed, nobles compelled to adopt European dress, and social norms were radically adjusted overnight. While the reforms were often effective, the personal follies, the intensity of Peter's enthusiasm, the occasional impulsiveness, the fascination with Western novelty, created a court simultaneously awed and anxious. There is a soft amusement in imagining courtiers tiptoeing through sudden decrees, learning to balance obedience with survival. Marie Leszczyńska, quiet resilience amid scandal. Marie Leszczyńska, queen consort of Louis XV, maintained quiet dignity amid a court rife with intrigue. Her personal misadventures were subtle, managing jealousies, handling rumors, and navigating the unpredictable whims of her husband. There is a gentle charm in her resilience. While not scandalous herself, she became entwined in the private follies of those around her, maintaining dignity with quiet grace. Observing her life is like watching a calm river flowing through turbulent terrain. The Romanovs, private errors and public consequences. The final Romanovs, particularly Nicholas II and Alexandra, illustrate private follies with enormous historical impact. Reliance on Rasputin, excessive devotion to tradition, and underestimation of public unrest quietly shaped the fall of the dynasty. The personal errors, trust placed in the wrong advisors, indulgence in private habits, and failure to perceive the broader consequences, are a soft, tragic echo through history. It reminds us that private follies of monarchs can have unexpectedly large consequences. Edward VIII, abdication for love. Edward VIII's decision to abdicate the British throne in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson is perhaps one of the most famous personal follies in modern royal history. While romantic in narrative, the choice was also scandalous, politically disruptive, and quietly destabilizing.
There is a gentle irony in a king stepping away from absolute power for personal desire, a reminder that even modern monarchs are human, fallible, and occasionally whimsical. Reflection on misadventures and follies. As we drift past these stories, it's clear that monarchy, for all its grandeur, cannot escape human nature. Personal indulgences, private mistakes, and quiet follies leave traces that ripple through time. For us, observing these events softly, there is both amusement and gentle melancholy. Kings and queens, enveloped in ceremony, authority, and expectation, remain deeply human, quirky, indulgent, mistaken, and wonderfully imperfect. The consequences of inbreeding and fragile bloodlines across generations. Welcome back. By now, your mind may be floating gently through the corridors of history, drifting past palaces, silent courts, and distant lands. Let's linger over a quieter yet persistent theme in royal history: the long-term consequences of inbreeding and fragile bloodlines across generations. This is a tale less of war or diplomacy and more of quiet genetics, subtle misfortune, and the occasional tragic irony. For centuries, European royalty sought to preserve pure dynasties. Cousins married cousins, distant relatives were paired to consolidate power, and careful genealogical charts became a form of quiet obsession. And yet, nature, as always, had its own plans. The Habsburg jaw and its legacy. The Habsburg dynasty remains perhaps the most famous example. Decades of cousin marriages produced Charles II of Spain, whose physical deformities, fragile health, and difficulty speaking were extreme manifestations of inbreeding. Yet Charles II was not an isolated case. His ancestors, careful to preserve dynastic purity, had quietly compounded genetic vulnerabilities. Over generations, the Habsburgs accumulated traits that weakened both body and mind, leaving kings who could barely fulfill the duties expected of them. It's almost meditative to consider the layers of cause and effect. A marriage arranged for political convenience, producing subtle vulnerabilities that only appear several generations later, quietly shaping history. The Spanish Bourbons and generational fragility. The Spanish Bourbons also illustrate this pattern. Cousin marriages and repeated dynastic alliances produced children who often struggled with health, fertility, and early mortality. Generations of careful strategy intended to consolidate power quietly undermined it in practice. The human cost is soft but undeniable. Fragile children, untimely deaths, and rulers ill-prepared for the demands of governance. For those observing history in quiet reflection, it is a reminder that long-term consequences often arrive gently but inevitably. The Portuguese royals, repetition and decline. Portuguese monarchs repeated similar patterns. Cousins married cousins, dynasties maintained appearances, and the consequences accumulated slowly. Some heirs were weak or sickly, while others simply failed to produce strong successors. These patterns remind us that power, wealth, and careful planning cannot override biology entirely. There is a subtle inevitability to it. The careful weaving of family trees may maintain appearances, but nature is quietly indifferent. The Bavarian kings, fragility in isolation. In Bavaria, repeated dynastic marriages produced rulers who were physically fragile, prone to illness, or temperamentally ill-suited to rule. Ludwig II, already familiar for his eccentricity, also inherited vulnerability through careful but ultimately short-sighted dynastic planning. His isolation, eccentricity, and personal struggles were quietly compounded by fragile bloodlines. History records the consequences, not as a dramatic spectacle, but as a slow, gentle unraveling over time. The Romanovs, genetics and governance. The Romanovs, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries, exemplify the quiet consequences of intermarriage among European royalty. Queen Victoria's descendants carried hemophilia into multiple royal families, affecting the Russian imperial line through Alexandra and her son Alexei. These inherited vulnerabilities were private yet politically significant. A disease that could have remained personal instead became entwined with the fate of a dynasty. The subtle intersection of genetics and governance reminds us that even distant decisions echo quietly across generations. The Medici, wealth, influence, and hidden fragility. The Medici, whose marriages often prioritized wealth over genetic diversity, provide another example. Their children were sometimes ill, fragile, or otherwise compromised despite immense privilege. The delicate balance of power, health, and succession illustrates a recurring theme. Status cannot entirely protect against biology. It's quietly sobering to imagine the meticulous arrangements, the careful plans, and the unintended consequences quietly unfolding in nursery rooms, drawing rooms, and palaces. England and Scotland, generational consequences. English and Scottish royalty also demonstrate the long-term effects of inbreeding. Successive marriages within limited aristocratic circles produced children who were often sickly or temperamentally vulnerable. Henry VIII's children, for instance, bore traces of frailty and complex health issues, shaping succession and policy in subtle ways. Even minor genetic consequences, difficulty in childbirth, fragile health, or reduced fertility, had quiet but lasting political effects. It's almost poetic, small, private human vulnerabilities rippling through dynasties, shaping nations over decades. The Danish and Norwegian lines, subtle patterns. In Scandinavia, dynastic marriages produced similar patterns of subtle fragility. While wars and politics dominate the historical record, private genetic consequences quietly influenced succession, governance, and royal health. Courts meticulously maintained appearances, but in private, fragile heirs and recurrent illnesses shaped the decisions of monarchs, advisors, and families. History, in its quiet way, preserves these patterns as both warning and fascination. Reflection on fragile bloodlines. As we drift past these stories, one theme becomes clear: dynastic ambition, careful genealogy, and political strategy often collide quietly with the stubborn realities of biology. Monarchs may have wealth, power, and advisors, but they cannot override inherited fragility, recessive traits, or the subtle consequences of repeated cousin marriages. For us, lying quietly in dim light, these stories are a gentle mix of melancholy and fascination. They remind us that behind gilded palaces and ceremonial robes are human lives, delicate and vulnerable, quietly shaping the course of history in ways both predictable and surprising. Nature's quiet verdict. Ultimately, the consequences of inbreeding and fragile bloodlines are a soft, ongoing commentary from nature. History records the outcomes without fanfare. sickly heirs, eccentric rulers, fragile dynasties. The narrative is slow, quiet and inexorable, like a candle burning gently in a darkened hall. And as we reflect, we notice a gentle irony. Monarchs spent centuries meticulously controlling dynastic succession, but nature, in its patience, quietly ensured that no lineage was ever entirely predictable. The lesson, soft and subtle, floats through history with quiet inevitability.
Welcome back. By now, your mind may feel like it is floating through corridors of memory and imagination, where tapestries of gold and velvet mingle with shadows of quiet human frailty. Tonight, we linger on the ironies, the gentle, almost absurd contrasts between expectation and reality in the lives of kings and queens. History often highlights triumphs, battles, or decrees, but there is a subtler, quieter fascination in noticing where ambition, privilege, and human nature intersect, sometimes with tragic comic results. The fair who resembled a turnip. Many monarchs were given flattering nicknames. Consider Edward IV of England, nicknamed the Fair, while contemporaneous portraits and descriptions suggest a face resembling, gently, a mildly confused turnip. There is something quietly amusing here, a reminder that public perception, propaganda, and personal appearance can diverge sharply. For those of us observing from a soft distance, it is a gentle meditation on the contrast between image and reality. Louis XIV and the sun that could cast shadows. Louis XIV, the Sun King, cultivated an image of absolute brilliance. He was resplendent, disciplined, and politically formidable. Yet even he could be petty, obsess over minutiae, or indulge in trivial rages over courtly etiquette. The irony is subtle but pervasive. A ruler who symbolized light and order, yet sometimes faltered over the smallest shadow of personal annoyance. It is a reminder that grandeur and human foible are not mutually exclusive. They quietly coexist. Henry VIII's quest for an heir. Henry VIII, obsessed with producing a male heir, married 6 times, executed wives, and disrupted religious life across England. And yet, the irony is palpable. After decades of turmoil, the line of succession still experienced fragility, with children who were sickly, politically constrained, or prematurely deceased. The contrast between expectation and outcome is almost poetic. History quietly observes the tension between ambition and nature, between desire and consequence. Catherine the Great and Enlightenment ideals. Catherine II, in theory, embraced Enlightenment principles, reason, learning, reform. In practice, she navigated court intrigues, indulged in personal pleasures, and occasionally acted with ruthless pragmatism. The gentle absurdity lies in the intersection of philosophy and daily life, a queen advocating progress while carefully managing her private indulgences, lovers, and image. It is quietly fascinating, a portrait of human contradiction. Ludwig II and castles that could not govern. Ludwig II of Bavaria provides another quiet lesson in ironic contrast. He dreams in castles of fairy tale proportions, yet the kingdom required practical governance he could not always provide. The tragic absurdity is subtle. Immense creativity and personal devotion, yet the practical demands of rulership remained unmet. History records both the beauty and the futility of these efforts, quietly preserved in stone and legend.
The English Stuarts, absolutism and fragility. The Stuarts, from James I to Charles I,
often embodied contrasts between authority and human frailty. They pursued absolute power, yet personal habits, indecision, or eccentricities undermined their own positions. We quietly observe the tension. Monarchs expected to command nations, yet limited by personality, health, or temperament. The result is neither shocking nor dramatic, simply a persistent, gentle irony stretching through decades. The Romanovs, opulence and inevitability. The final Romanovs offer a poignant study in contrast. Surrounded by luxury, privilege, and tradition, they faced revolution, political unrest, and personal tragedy. Their lives were elaborate, ritualized, and private, yet history's quiet inevitability, war, disease, and social change intervened regardless of gold or ceremony. It is a reminder that even the most insulated lives are not exempt from the rhythms of time. Opulence cannot fully guard against misfortune, and the irony lies in the contrast between expectation and reality. Elizabeth I, strength and isolation. Elizabeth I of England ruled with remarkable skill, yet her personal life was isolated, restrained, and governed by ritual. The irony is subtle. Supreme authority coupled with private loneliness, personal control mingled with careful concealment. There is a quiet beauty in this contrast, the intertwining of immense public power and private restraint, creating a human portrait that is both admirable and melancholic. Reflection on royal contrasts. As we drift past these stories, a theme emerges. Royal lives are defined not solely by triumph or failure, but by subtle contrasts. Power coexists with fragility, grandeur with pettiness, expectation with absurdity. For us, observing history in dim light, these contrasts are both soothing and intriguing. They remind us that behind crowns, ceremonies, and dynasties are human beings, quirky, flawed, and quietly remarkable. A gentle closing reflection. And so, as we let our minds settle, consider the soft rhythm of these lives. Kings walking carefully through marble halls, queens navigating rumor and intrigue, heirs learning to bear weight far too early. The ironies, follies, and fragile patterns echo gently through time, like a soft murmur of history itself. It is a reminder, quietly, that human nature persists in every age, every throne, every chamber. Power, wealth, and ceremony may shape the stage, but it is always the subtle, private human elements that linger in memory. The odd habits, the petty rages, the fragile children, the quiet misadventures. And with that, we drift softly through the corridors of history, leaving behind the echoes of monarchs and settling into the gentle rhythm of time itself.
Reflections on the quiet lives of monarchs. Welcome back. As the soft hum of history settles around us, let us linger in the quieter moments, those overlooked details, subtle patterns, and gentle oddities that made monarchs human. Tonight we have wandered through corridors of power, nurseries of fragile heirs, and chambers of secret indulgence. Now we pause to reflect on what it all quietly tells us. The human behind the crown. Every king, queen, and heir we have encountered was first human, curious, fragile, eccentric, and occasionally foolish. Crowns do not remove vulnerability. They simply place it under a brighter light. A child like Edward V may vanish quietly in a tower, yet his fears, hopes, and small pleasures are entirely recognizable. A king like Ludwig II
may wander through dreamlike halls, yet the longing, isolation, and devotion in those wandering steps are universal in their quiet intensity. It is comforting to imagine these figures not as distant icons of power, but as people who navigated the same small joys, anxieties, and absurdities we do, albeit in rooms lined with gold, silk, and history itself. Power and fragility. We have seen again and again that power does not equate to invincibility. Louis XIV, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great wielded immense authority, yet private habits, misjudgments, or human frailty quietly shaped their reigns. Nature, circumstance, and personal eccentricities worked alongside or sometimes against dynastic ambition. For us, the lesson is soft but clear. Even those who seem untouchable are subject to the same unpredictabilities that shape ordinary life. And sometimes these quiet contradictions between grandeur and fragility create the most enduring impressions of history. The slow echo of choices. Choices, even small or private ones, ripple quietly through time. Henry VIII's marriages, Charles II's indulgences, or the Romanovs' trust in Rasputin were not always dramatic in the moment, yet their consequences stretched far beyond the chambers where they occurred. It is soothing, in a way, to observe history like this not as a series of shocks and climaxes, but as a slow accumulation of human behavior, repetition, and consequence. A private whim, a habitual oddity, or a misjudged plan quietly shapes generations. And in that rhythm there is a gentle constancy, almost like a heartbeat in the hush of a palace at night. Eccentricity as a quiet lens. Eccentricity, whether in Peter the Great's hands-on projects, George IV's extravagances, or Charles VI's fragile imaginings, offers a lens into the human side of monarchy. These small details, often recorded in diaries, letters, and observations, allow us to step softly into their world, to imagine life under crowns without grandeur overshadowing humanity. It is quietly fascinating to consider. A king obsessing over a palace, a queen writing endless letters, a child carefully measured and guided for decades, all shaping history in ways that are both significant and subtle. The gentle irony of history. We have wandered through stories of ambition and failure, indulgence and restraint, brilliance and folly. Across time and geography, monarchs reveal a persistent irony. Those most surrounded by luxury, authority, and guidance are still subject to the same small human inconsistencies that define all life. There is a soft humor here, not in mockery, but in the quiet observation that absolute power and human frailty coexist, often in ways that are gently absurd.
A calm meditation on time. As we let our thoughts settle, consider the slow passage of time. Dynasties rise and fall, children grow and vanish, and the echoes of private decisions quietly resonate. History, observed softly, is less a series of dramatic peaks than a gentle current, carrying lives, choices, and human idiosyncrasies along a steady, unhurried flow. There is something deeply soothing in this perspective. It allows us to witness the past not as a spectacle, but as a quiet meditation,
a series of human moments, small and grand, intertwined with circumstance, fortune, and character. Leaving the palaces behind. As our journey through royal lives draws to a close, imagine the quiet corridors emptying, the flickering candlelight dimming, and the distant echo of footsteps fading into shadow. Children once anxious, kings once proud, queens once careful, all remain in memory not as distant idols, but as gentle companions on this nocturnal stroll through history. And in this quiet reflection, there is peace. The folly, the eccentricity, the tragedy, and the grandeur all merge into a soft, flowing narrative that is, ultimately, profoundly human. So as you settle further into the calm of evening, consider the soft, persistent lessons of monarchs past, that even power cannot escape vulnerability, that private habits shape public outcomes, and that eccentricity, indulgence, and misjudgment are quietly universal. History in this gentle light is less a series of events than a series of human experiences, rich, flawed, and enduring. And perhaps, as we leave these palaces and corridors behind, we carry a sense of calm fascination with us, an understanding that the grand and the trivial, the tragic and the absurd, are quietly intertwined in every human life, crown or no crown.
Top 10 Biggest Secrets and Mysteries of Ancient Egypt. Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a land of golden sands, silent temples, and the slow, measured flow of the Nile. Imagine yourself in a warm, dimly lit room, perhaps with a soft blanket, as we gently wander through the mysteries of ancient Egypt, its secrets, its strange customs, and the private lives of those who ruled with crowns of gold. Tonight we will not rush. We will move slowly, softly, letting history unfold like a quiet river. Some of these stories are dark, some peculiar, and some simply human. And through them we will glimpse a civilization that, for all its grandeur, was filled with oddities, secrets, and quiet tragedies. The hidden tombs and forgotten pharaohs. We begin with the pharaohs, rulers whose lives were measured not only in years, but in tombs, monuments, and eternal ambitions. Many pharaohs were forgotten even as their monuments endured. Temples stood proudly, while names faded from memory, and tombs remained undiscovered for centuries, quietly holding the stories of men and women who shaped history, yet vanished almost without a trace. Consider Pharaoh Tutankhamun. His reign was brief, his body fragile, yet his tomb would become one of the most famous in modern times. Hidden for centuries beneath the sands, it preserved treasures, secrets, and the echoes of a child king's life. And so, quietly, we see that history sometimes preserves more by accident than by design. Then there are pharaohs like Akhenaten, whose radical religious experiments reshaped Egypt, only for successors to erase his memory almost entirely. Temples were defaced, names omitted from king lists, and history itself became a quiet eraser of inconvenient facts. Imagine the paradox: immense power, lasting monuments, and yet a slow, deliberate fading into obscurity. Even the Great Pyramids held secrets, many yet unknown. Beyond burial chambers, hidden passages, and elaborate hieroglyphs, there is an elegance to their quiet enigma, a reminder that human ambition often leaves mysteries for generations to ponder softly. Royal oddities and private lives. Now let us drift over to the private lives of pharaohs and queens, where eccentricity and human folly quietly shaped history. Cleopatra VII, famously strategic and charismatic, was also deeply human, witty, ambitious, and capable of both grand strategy and personal indulgence. Her life reminds us that history's grand narratives are entwined with intimate decisions, private indulgences, and occasionally quiet mistakes. Some pharaohs were physically fragile, some temperamentally peculiar, and others strangely devoted to personal rituals. Ramses II, for instance, loved monumental building, yet personal devotion to his family and distant wars created tension and irony. His private life, carefully orchestrated and yet full of contradiction, offers a quiet glimpse into the human side of ancient authority. The irony of power is evident throughout. Pharaohs who wielded absolute authority sometimes struggled with small, personal vulnerabilities, temper, obsession, fear, or curiosity. These nuances remind us that history, no matter how monumental, is built upon deeply human experiences. Dynastic oddities and inbreeding. We gently move to dynasties and their intricate family trees. Pharaohs often married siblings or cousins to preserve divine bloodlines, creating patterns of inbreeding that left subtle or dramatic consequences. Physical deformities, fragile health, and unexpected vulnerabilities quietly rippled through generations. Consider Tutankhamun again. His lineage reflects complex family relations that were common in the royal court. While dynasties sought purity, biology quietly ensured that even divine rulers were not immune to fragility. This tension between expectation and reality, between ambition and consequence, echoes throughout history like a soft, persistent whisper. Misguided royal decisions. Even the most powerful pharaohs made choices with unintended consequences. Some campaigns failed due to logistical misjudgments, others because of court intrigue or overconfidence. Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most successful female rulers, navigated this carefully, yet her successors attempted to erase her memory, another quiet lesson in the impermanence of perceived wisdom. It is fascinating to note how small, private choices, alliances, rituals, or building projects could quietly reshape dynasties. Power was absolute, yet human nature, circumstance, and misjudgment quietly guided outcomes, often with tragic or ironic results. Secrets of tomb construction. Pyramids and tombs are not only architectural marvels, they are silent repositories of personal and political secrets. Hidden chambers, cryptic inscriptions, and carefully planned burial rituals reflect both grandeur and private obsession. Pharaohs planned for eternity, yet many secrets were accidentally preserved, waiting centuries for discovery. The human element is present even here. Laborers, architects, and courtiers each added subtle personal touches, creating a quiet mosaic of human effort, ambition, and sometimes exhaustion. The grandeur of tombs, contrasted with the fragility of those buried within, creates a gentle irony that hums softly through history.
Royal decisions that went hilariously or tragically wrong. We have encountered kings who, despite power, made errors that quietly shaped history. Louis XVI's flight to Varennes, Napoleon's Russian campaign, Henry VIII's religious upheavals.
These moments revealed the persistent tension between human desire, misjudgment, and consequence. Even small personal whims, like Marie Antoinette's perceived extravagance or Charles I's personal rule, rippled through nations. Quietly, these examples remind us that absolute authority is never immune to human foibles, and that history often accumulates slowly, with gentle inevitability. The strange habits and personal oddities of monarchs. Every monarch has private routines, quirks, and eccentricities. Charles VI feared he might shatter like glass. Peter the Great rolled up his sleeves and worked alongside carpenters. Ludwig II wandered dreamlike through elaborate castles. These habits, whether obsessive, whimsical, or simply human, provide a gentle lens into lives otherwise defined by ceremony and expectation. They remind us that eccentricity often persists quietly alongside authority, shaping perception, governance, and legacy in subtle ways. Royal misadventures, scandals, and private follies. Indulgence, rumor, and misjudgment quietly color history. Louis XV's lovers, George IV's Brighton pavilion, Charles II's courtly excess all revealed the subtle intersection of personal desire and public consequence. Even scandals like the Diamond Necklace affair or Edward VIII's abdication illustrate that the private choices of monarchs can ripple outward, quietly affecting nations and shaping collective memory. Observation from a soft distance allows us to witness folly without drama, absurdity without shock, and humanity without judgment. Consequences of inbreeding and fragile bloodlines. The Habsburg jaw, hemophilia among Victoria's descendants, and fragile heirs across Europe remind us that dynastic planning cannot entirely overcome biology. Royal ambition, carefully plotted marriages, and the pursuit of pure bloodlines often produced subtle or profound vulnerabilities. These consequences are quiet but persistent. Fragile rulers, ill heirs, and occasional dynastic collapse. History preserves them softly, a reminder of nature's gentle, inevitable oversight over even the most controlled human systems. Ironic contrasts and tragic absurdities of royal lives. Monarchs were simultaneously magnificent and fallible. Edward IV was called the Fair, while resembling a mildly confused turnip. Louis XIV embodied grandeur, while obsessing over minor slights. Henry VIII pursued heirs, yet struggled to secure a lasting line. The persistent irony, gently observed, is that power magnifies human contradictions. Privilege does not prevent error. Indulgence does not erase consequence. And history, quietly, is shaped as much by personality as by policy. Reflections on the quiet lives of monarchs. Finally, we pause to reflect. Every king and queen was first human, fragile, curious, indulgent, and sometimes absurd. Private habits, eccentricities, and misjudgments quietly shaped dynasties, leaving echoes that persist in tombs, palaces, and records. As we settle into this soft, nocturnal meditation, consider the gentle lessons. Vulnerability coexists with authority. Choices ripple across generations, and eccentricity, indulgence, and folly quietly persist even in the highest chambers of power. History, observed softly, is less a drama of events than a tapestry of human experiences, rich, flawed, enduring, and strangely comforting. And with that, we leave the corridors of time, the echoes of monarchs softly fading, carrying with us a sense of calm fascination with the lives of those who once walked the gilded halls of the past.